everyone. Welcome back to the broadcast. We have a very special episode for you today. I am a little fangirling about this, to actually a lot fangirling, I'm going to be honest, with our guest today, who is, her name is Andrea Dunlop. And if you don't know that name yet, you should, and you will after this, because there are many mediums in which you can absorb her content, consume, that's the word I'm looking for, consume her content in various different forms. So I'm going to read this from one of the websites in which you're listed, because this describes you better than I could, I think. So Andrea Dunlop, I found her, you guys, because she does a podcast called Nobody Should Believe Me. It is on the subject Munchausen by proxy, also called medical child abuse, some other things. We're going to focus on that today, that sort of topic, because we are going to go into a documentary called Take Care of Maya. But Andrea Dunlop's background is, this is listed from munchausensupport.com, of which she is a founder. Andrea Dunlop was inspired to work on Munchausen by proxy awareness after a member of her family was investigated for abuse, an event which changed the course of her life and inspired her 2019 novel, We Came Here to Forget, which, by the way, you guys, I've read. It's amazing. It's such a good book. It's a work of fiction. If you're looking for some good fiction to read, it's really awesome. Anyway, moving on. While doing press for her book, she met Dr. Mark Feldman and later joined the APSAC's Munchausen by Proxy Committee, and that is American Professional Society of the Abuse on Children. Andrea is the host and creator of the true hit crime podcast about Munchausen by proxy, Nobody Should Believe Me, which has been downloaded more than 5 million times since its launch. She's also the author of 2 previous novels, Losing the Light, 2016, and She Regrets Nothing in 2018. Her books have been featured in Town and Country, Bustle, In Style, Us Weekly, Vanity Fair, People Magazine, and elsewhere. She lives with her husband and daughter in Seattle, Washington. Don't you have another child?
I gotta update that. I have another book and another child since I wrote that. So
two children.
Note to self, update
hi,
bio.
Andrea.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you decided to do that you came on here to do this. We're going to be talking today about, there's a Netflix documentary called Take Care of Maya. Grab your heartstrings, bring out the tissue. This is such a terrible, horrible thing that has happened, and it's really designed to pull at the heartstrings. And the thing about it is, it's actually not really an accurate documentary of the real situation, but it also brings up so many things. And so we're going to talk about sort of all of that, as you are an expert on not only Munchausen by proxy, medical child abuse, but also sort of that subject in the media, as you do a lot. You've been featured. Your podcast has been on the Apple's new and noteworthy lists. So you guys, you really should check it out. Anyway, I'm gonna let you go from there. Let's start with Take Care of Maya.
Sure. So, yeah, as you said, I think this is a very emotionally affecting film, and it is the story of the Kowalskis is a very sad story. It's just not the exact sad story that's portrayed in the film. And I have gone down the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes on this case, because basically how this unfolded is that last summer, Take Care of Maya came out, I believe it was July. And so I was making the show already. I think we were in our 2nd season or about to launch our 2nd season of the show. So the show was on the air. And I was aware of this case. I'd been aware of this case for a long time. The sort of group of professionals within that APSAC committee that you mentioned that I'm on, a group of professionals who works on Munchausen by proxy cases throughout the country, is very small. And so, that case was a well-known one already. And so I knew the movie was coming out. I'd read the New York Magazine piece, which I critiqued at length on the show, if you've listened to it, and was just aware that this portrayal was probably going to be very much in the favor of the Kowalskis and their upcoming lawsuit against Johns Hopkins All Children's Children's. And so I sort of reluctantly was like, okay, I really have to cover this movie in some form. I can't sort of ignore this case. This is the biggest Munchausen related case that we'll probably see in, a long, long time, certainly the biggest one since the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case. And so I watched the movie. I was horrified by the way it was portrayed, just in terms of how much context about medical child abuse and Munchausen by proxy was left out. The fact that it had portrayed essentially Munchausen by proxy as something that was not real, and just suspected that there were a lot of holes in the story. And obviously it was just, in the way it was made, was very weighted. I finally did the math, and there was, I think, something like 5 to 7 minutes of depositions from Johns Hopkins providers played in the movie, which was meant to like sort of represent the other side, and that was it. So so I was dismayed by the film, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do a bonus episode. I'm going to pull in some of my experts. We're going to talk about it. We're going to give viewers some context for sort of how to metabolize this and view this responsibly, and then I will move on with my life. And that is not what happened.
Yes.
I got very pulled into this case. I was like, okay, then I will do a 4-part mini series. And at this point, with the first 2 seasons of the show, we'd spent years making them. And so this was a very different format for us to sort of like jump into covering something in real time. And I was like, okay, never mind. We're going to do a season in real time. We're going to do a full season. I ended up making 14 episodes. I flew to Florida to do a couple of interviews with the lead attorney for Johns Hopkins and Dr. Sally Smith, who was the child abuse pediatrician who made the report about the abuse. She was not the person who reported it, but she was the one who did the medical record review, et cetera, and had
She's
been
the
made
evil
very
child
much
hater.
Yeah, exactly. Had been very villainized.
Facts to tear families apart, according
right.
to the document.
We'll get into all that.
Quote,
Yeah, she was very
documented.
much portrayed as a villain in the film and in a lot of the media coverage around this case and around several other cases. And so, so it was a crazy experience making this season. The Kowalskis had a lawsuit against, this is taking place in Florida, and that's important context because Florida,
for a variety of reasons,
sort of the most Florida case that ever Florida'd. And I say that with all like the love in my heart for many people who live in
Yes.
Florida, but holy moly.
But Florida, come on, am I right?
Yeah, Florida's going to Florida, especially when related to something like that does essentially become a parents' rights issue, which we'll get into. But
Yes.
so they had a lawsuit that had been in the works for years against Johns Hopkins All Children's, and originally there was a bunch of other people named in the suit. There was Dr. Sally Smith and a specific person from the hospital social worker and DCF, and then eventually by the time it got to court, it was just Jack Kowalski v. Johns Hopkins All Children's. So there was a trial. It was 8 week long. There was a trial. It was 8 weeks long. I watched just about every minute of the depositions, of the testimony, and all the court goings on. It was broadcast on both Court TV and Law and Order, which is not Law and Order, Law and Crime Network, which is
I knew.
Not Law and Order. Unfortunately, this does not have the arc of a Law and Order episode where everything works
I don't
out
know.
by then.
I feel like it absolutely does.
Maybe in the end, I think people don't realize
yet.
the extent to which we are halfway through this story at this current point in time.
No, I don't even think we're halfway. I don't think we're halfway.
At any rate, that trial ended with a devastating verdict where the jury awarded the Kowalskis $200+ million for medical malpractice. I believe there was part of all kinds of whole sort of laundry list of things. There was a false imprisonment charge. There was an intentional infliction of emotional distress that was related to Beata's suicide. So one of the things I think people really do not have any grasp on is the number of very scary legal precedents that this verdict sets if it is allowed to stand. So
which is why I say it's not over. It's not even halfway there. As a lawyer myself, I'm like, oh no, this is just the trial. So many legal errors. This is going a long time.
Right. And, it was a wild experience to cover it in real time. I had probably more conflict with other people in terms of some fellow podcasters, fans of the movie, people, parents' rights people, QAnon influencers, you name it. So it was a wild experience for me. This is the first time I've watched a trial beginning to end. And so I think I learned a lot about sort of all the various goings on there. And I think, the more, and I'm sure, Katrina, that this is something that you already know, having been in, a litigator, it's like, I think if you are sort of going about your life and you don't have that much interaction with the legal system, it can be comforting to think that sort of things work the way that they're supposed to. And you don't realize how very many human beings are involved in this process that are making human decisions based on their own biases, based on their own, what they stand to gain or lose, based on their own motivations in all their sort of human form. And so that was a big learning lesson of this, of me for me of watching this trial. And yeah, it's I think in the media, it's treating it as very, the media is treating it very much as like a done deal. Like they won their verdict in court, they had their day in court, a jury made a decision. And that is not, that's not what this is. That's not what's happening here. This is a long, long way from being removed.
Yeah. So let me back up just a little bit. For those of you guys who have not watched Take Care of Maya, which it's like, I hesitate. I don't like telling people to watch it because it is so not a documentary. It's so like Liar, Liar, Pants on Fire, like in the way that we know. And of course, I'm saying this as I've done all my research is just listening to your research. So my research isn't independent, but yours does. Like you do all the independent research. You've gone through all the court documents and things like that. You've read the reports that we can get your hands on. Some you can't, obviously, as has been talked about. But so, and when we're not going to go through like the documentary, scene by scene, if you want that kind of level of breakdown of it, go listen to Andrea's podcast season on it, because you do, and you have extra episodes as you're watching the actual real trial unfold. So if you can get it in like a 3D form, it's really kind of like, holy shit, if you really want to immerse yourself. But the documentary is supposed, or the show is supposedly about this girl named Maya, who's is a teenager at the time we meet her on the show, but she starts off very young. She's, as a child, been diagnosed with allegedly CRPS, which is complex regional pain syndrome. And then she ends up in the hospital because there's accusations or not accusations at this point. The exact how the timeline flowed about suspicions turning into allegations, turning into actual complaints, like the process down the line, but of medical child abuse by Beata, the mother, that she was actually inflicting this on Maya. We'll talk about, I want to talk about all that. It's called Munchausen by proxy. It's also called medical child abuse, fictitious disease imposed on another, I believe,
disorder,
is the other
factitious disorder imposed on another.
Disorder.
Yes, that's the name of the sort of underlying psychiatric condition that is tied to this abuse. Yes.
Right. So all of that is what's happening, right? That's the allegation, is that she's doing this to her child, and somewhere in this process, the hospital separates the mother and child.
Well, actually, the court does. So the court,
right. Yeah. I was just listening to
not
that.
The hospital, right?
Very important distinction. The hospital is just housing her because they're
required
complex.
to by law. Yeah, they're being required to by law. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions.
Yes.
And of course, that's played up in the film and a lot of the media coverage. And I think what I've come to understand about this film is, intentionally or not, it is a PR piece for Jack Kowalski's lawsuit, right?
100% intentional. 100%.
And so that confusion I don't think is accidental. And the hospital was blamed for decisions that the court made. And when a hospital reports abuse, which they're required to by law. By the way, this is one of the biggest problems with this verdict, is how it affects mandatory reporting. And as it stands right now, hospitals in every state, doctors in every state in the country are mandatory reporters, which means that they can face felony charges if they are known to have had suspicions that they did not report on, right? Reasonable suspicion of abuse, they have to report it. And then from there, a court makes a decision, right? So the court in this case issued a shelter order, which means exactly what it sounds like. That child shelters in place, they stay where they are. And, courts consider hospitals safe spaces for children. So that's the other thing I think people don't realize, is how many hospitals around the country, especially at large children's hospitals, but everywhere really, are going to have children under shelter care with them, because if that they are there when it happens, there may not be a safe alternative for that child to be discharged to if they cannot be sent home with their parents safely. And so many, many hospitals find themselves in this position. And it was not the hospital's decision to separate Maya from her parents. That came from the court. They did not have a choice.
Correct. And thank you for clarifying on that, because that is a very important distinction. It's also a very important legal distinction, as you talked about how by the end, when the trial actually went forward, it was just the hospital versus and Jack Kowalski, and a lot of these other entities and things had been removed or settled out, or you can't reach them because they're government, or and all of these different things, stuff that I'm not going to bore you with how that all works. Suffice to say, in any case, yes, those distinctions are very important. And in the process, while the hospital was taking care of Maya, ironically, in the hospital, the mother, Beata, committed suicide. And so this lawsuit is the family suing the hospital system and all of the various individuals involved for basically saying that you took Maya and Beata away from each other, and that resulted in Beata's suicide. Therefore, there's all these underlying causes of action. We're going to say that you're responsible for all these things that happened. So that's sort of the framework of the lawsuit that went. It's not necessarily related to Maya's care, saying,
well, it was also because there was also a medical malpractice charge. So what they were alleging was that basically by not continuing to give Maya massive doses of ketamine, which she had been receiving for her underlying alleged diagnosis of CRPS. And I say alleged because after my reams and reams of research into both how Beata arrived at this diagnosis, how she sought it out from Dr. Kirkpatrick, who's quite the character in the film and in real life, and the number of other doctors, both treating physicians and experts in CRPS, that testified that Maya does not have CRPS, but something called conversion disorder. But they were alleging that this was also medical malpractice because by not continuing to give this child massive, 10x doses of intravenous ketamine, that was medical malpractice. They were not going to the standard of care, which is ludicrous. Which
is ludicrous because the ketamine coma is not a standard of care, hence why she had to go to Mexico to get it.
Right. And the ketamine coma was a separate thing. I mean, that was when she was in Mexico. She was being put under anesthesia for 5 days and being given, again, massive doses of ketamine. She had received in the year prior, I believe, 55 ketamine infusions at a local clinic in Florida. So I mean that is legal to do, but it is not considered the standard of care in any by the medical establishment. Considering there was only one doctor. It is very far outside the standard of care.
Yeah, yes, it's one or two doctors in the entire country that have done this, right? And she found him. Okay, so yeah, so we've said that this is not a documentary. And one of where the Fraudcast was founded upon uncovering fraud, right? So that's part of why I wanted to do this, is that I wanted to jump on this to help get this side of the story out, right? That this isn't a documentary. I don't like sending people to watch it, because it is presented as it is a documentary. Therefore, you think this is unbiased, raw truth, and it's not, because as you have learned from going through all of the documentation and whatnot, that there was so much that was missing from the movie. Briefly, I want to say, okay, so the way that the court came out, ultimately the result was in favor of the Kowalskis, saying that the hospital intentionally did this with this intent to hurt them and to cause them this injury, and they're doing it for fun just to hurt this family, and let's get Beata to commit suicide, is basically the allegation. Somewhere along the line, the judge decided that the medical child abuse portion of the case, and this is what really got me as a lawyer, and this I would love to talk to, as you have had the opportunity to talk to the legal team involved on the hospital side. And just because of the nature of my work, I'm not normally on the same side as the big, large corporation, but In this case, I am. So I would love to sit and hear that. So what happened was the judge decided that this medical child abuse stuff was malarkey and did not need to come into the trial. Which the entire case was the whole reason why Maya was at the hospital was because of these allegations of medical child abuse, which the court determined was necessary to separate them.
Yeah.
So the hospital, with their mandate of taking care of the child, did so. And as a result, now is in court having to pay out over $2 million, $2 billion or whatever it is, to the Kowalskis, never once being able to talk about the medical child abuse in the way at all as a defense or as it existed. It's like he completely removed it from the context. And without that very important context, this case doesn't make any sense. And of course, if you're going to say, well, my daughter was in the hospital and somewhere in there they decided to keep her overnight and not give her any treatment that she needed to get. Like, that's not a thing. Like,
Yeah. So, I mean, that was one of the crazier things that happened during the trial, and there were many to choose from. But I mean, worse than just omitting it from the testimony, what the judge actually did, this is Judge Hunter Carroll, what he actually did was let the plaintiff side, the Kowalskis and Gregory Anderson, their lead attorney, talk at length about why Beata did not, quote, have Munchausen by proxy. And what they did was cast it very much as a psychiatric disorder. And this is extremely problematic. It's not the way to look at this. It's not something where, they talked about, oh, she had a psychological evaluation and the evaluator said, nope, she doesn't have it. And that's not the standard of care, so to speak. I mean, that's not what the peer, that's not how it works. That's not what the peer-reviewed science says is like a proper way to evaluate whether or not medical child abuse, which is an act, not a state of mind, has been occurring. And so they let them go on and on in their opening statements. They had, testimony. They asked Dr. Chopra, was this person abusing their child? And he said, no. Dr. Chopra, it's my opinion that Dr. Chopra doesn't really believe medical child abuse exists. That's a whole other sort of thing. But basically they let them go on. Let the plaintiff side, they did their entire, plaintiff goes first, defense goes second. They got halfway through the trial, and before the defense could put on their experts or let Dr. Sally Smith talk about how she came to that conclusion that medical child abuse had been occurring, which the court did base its decision on, before Detective Stephanie Graham, who was investigating Beata, could talk about her investigation, Judge Hunter Carroll said, medical child abuse, Munchausen by proxy, is not relevant to this case. I'm not going to allow any further testimony on it. So he let their side go and say she doesn't have it and here's why. And, they were not correct about how to evaluate whether
all
or not
of that is incorrect, right?
All of it was incorrect. They were questioning witnesses about the DSM. I mean, it's bonkers. And then they made the defense, they hamstrung the defense from sharing their extremely strong evidence that this was a case of medical child abuse, and that furthermore, that this child's life was in very real danger if she'd been allowed to leave the hospital. So without that, I sympathize with the jury. There was a lot of jury shenanigans that we just don't even have time to get into. You can go to the podcast for that. There's a lot going on with this jury. But I sympathize with them that on the one hand, it's something I think about a lot as a podcaster and as a novelist, we're all susceptible to a narrative. We need a narrative to help us make sense of a situation and take care of Maya and, which was essentially the plaintiff's story. I mean, the filmmakers coordinated heavily with the Kowalskis and their attorney, Gregory Anderson. I mean, Gregory Anderson was the first person Caitlin Keating, the producer of the film, got in touch with, right? Like you can see that sort of lineage of how that story was made. They were allowed to tell a very strong, compelling story, which is these parents brought their child to the hospital for help because she was having a, quote, relapse of CRPS. That was their claim because she was in pain. They brought her to the hospital for help. The hospital turned around and kidnapped their daughter. And that series of events caused Beata's death by suicide, and they are to blame. And look at this poor family that suffered so much. And again, you will have no argument from me that this family has suffered a great deal. It's just sort of who is responsible for that is that's a question. And that's a very compelling human narrative that's kind of easy to plug into, right?
Mhm.
And the hospital was not allowed to counter that narrative with what I believe is the truth and what I know is supported by the documentation in this case, which I've read thousands of pages of at this point,
Mhm.
which is that this was a situation of medical child abuse that had been escalating, that was putting this child's life in danger, and that this parent, Beata, was insisting on this treatment that was not within the hospital's standard of care because it's not accepted as the standard of care for CRPS, even if she did in fact have this diagnosis. And that Beata was saying, if you're not going to give her the ketamine that I'm requesting, demanding, then I am going to take her and put her in hospice care so that she can finally die. And people need to understand that this is how children die when they die in cases of medical child abuse. There's a situation, the case of this little girl, Olivia Gant, that is a very famous case that haunts me, where I believe she was 6 years old at the time. She was allowed to leave despite the hospital having suspicions, and they did not report. And that child was allowed to leave and go home, and her mother put her in hospice care, and she starved to death. And this was not uncovered until years later when the mom was trying to take her other child for cancer treatment, that this child did not have cancer. And they uncovered the fact of what had happened in this case. So this is not without precedent. There was every reason to believe that this is what this mother was going to do because she was escalating these treatments that she was subjecting her daughter to. And just because she found doctors who were willing to go along with it does not remove her culpability. And so I think that is a story that the defense was not allowed to tell. And so what they ended up having was this sort of disparate pieces of testimony from all these doctors, where if you have the context, they're very compelling. But for the jurors, they could very easily see this as, well, the doctors on one side are saying one thing and the doctors on the other side. So this is just a disagreement between doctors. And they're going to go with the more emotionally compelling story, especially if it fits into sort of their existing beliefs about what rights parents should have with the medical care of their children and sort of parents' rights in general. And so I think like that is the piece where people who are saying, well, you know what, like this has been settled in court. It's like, well, the judge sat on the scale. So I don't think this has been settled in court.
I mean, as a lawyer, when I heard that what was happening there and from the legal perspective, I mean, I'm automatically thinking all these appealable issues. I don't even practice in Florida. I don't practice in this area of law. I don't have any knowledge of what the case law is behind it, but I can tell you that from just a simple litigation perspective, that there are things that are supposed to protect you, and there are appealable issues with that because you have all of these you have this situation where one side didn't get their due process because it was presented and they didn't get to respond to it. And so there's certain things that are inherent in any law anywhere in all litigation, and that's sort of one of them. That's one of the like the due process fairness stuff. And they're looking into all of that. There are so many appealable issues on this, so many ways that the judge erred, that honestly my gut is confident that this is not going to stand as is. And especially as I've listened to your materials and your content on it as it's gone on since then, because of the chill effect that this has on the mandatory reporting. How can you in good faith mandatorily report what you're mandated to report when if you do, you could be sued for millions of dollars and win, and and the other side could win.
Yeah. And I want to say about that, Katrina, that as I've been, so deep in this case and looking at the reverberations that it's having around the country, both in terms of like similar lawsuits being waged and also just like the chilling effect that I know that this is having on mandatory reporting, because it is. And yeah, I mean, it is an impossible legal position to put providers in, because you're saying on the one hand, if you don't report your reasonable suspicions of abuse, you can be charged with a felony. And you could have something like the Olivia Gant case where the hospital was sued by the grandparents of that child. And then on the other hand, and also you're sort of like not doing your duty of care, which is to do no harm, right? Like we trust pediatric medical professionals in the community to protect our children. They are part of that ecosystem, like teachers, like, the police, if they're responding to a child abuse crime. Like we are putting these people in a place where we trust them with children. And that they're an important part of the sort of community infrastructure of protecting children. And so you're saying on the one hand, you're liable if you don't, but if you do, you can be hauled to court. You can be made the villain of a Netflix film. You can be excoriated in the media, and that can lead to basically your life can be ruined over this.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be held, liable in a court of law. And that is not tenable, right? You cannot have both of those things. And
which is why legally I'm like, no, from a public policy perspective, there's so many legal arguments I can make just on that point.
Right. And I think that is why I think that Johns Hopkins is very, I believe they've shown so far, they're very committed to seeing this through. And I think what I have realized, the revelation that I've had as I've been covering this case and sort of looking at who its, most fervent supporters are. And I'm not talking about sort of the majority of people that have maybe seen the Kowalskis in People and watched the film and are just sort of passive observers that are sort of
crime
as I've done about how many other millions of cases I don't know, where I've sort of been oh yeah, that one documentary, and just have this passing awareness of it. There's a lot of people that I think are oh, that poor family, and it's great that they won some money. And I can totally sympathize why if people don't know. But the most fervent supporters of people have really gotten behind this case, the people that are sort of using this case to spread other cases like it and other sort of lawsuits like it. I sort of thought, so many people who are supporting this case don't understand what this is going to do to mandatory reporting. And what I've come to understand is this is not an unintended consequence. This is the point. Mm-hmm. They are trying to get mandatory reporting overturned because they don't believe in it, and they don't believe that those people should have immunity in court. And so I think people really need to understand that that is a possible outcome of this case if it's not overturned, and that was the point. I don't know if that's Jack Kowalski's point. I don't know what lives in his heart. I don't know if he's just an opportunist or what, but I
suspect he was gotten to by law firms and others that do have the agenda,
the ideology.
Right.
Yeah,
that's how lawsuits come about like this, is because there's other groups and people and lawyers who have these agendas. They go find the cases, right?
Right.
So you've got these people, and they've, as you've said, this is sort of not spawned, but it has certainly given life to this parents' choice, parents' rights thing that is a whole other thing, and it's spilling into this arena. And I don't think that's an accident, because
no, and they're saying it I think when you look at sort of Gregory Anderson, who's the lead attorney for the Kowalski family, if you look at his comments to the media and sort of that, it's taking place in Venice, Florida, which is a very, very red place. And this sort of far right, certainly not represented by all conservatives by any mean, but the far right sort of parents' rights group, what they're advocating, the rights that they are advocating for here, just so we're clear, is that they want parents to be able to take their children to the hospital. And, and this is not just with medical child abuse, other forms of abuse as well, that if that child is abusing their parent, and if there are those, again, there's a lot of peer-reviewed research and science around detecting abuse. If those medical professionals detect abuse, that they should not be allowed to report that abuse, that they should not be protected if they report that abuse, that those parents should be able to bring their children in for treatment and just leave and do with them as they see fit and make all of the sort of choices around their children, and basically that their children are their property. That's the right that they are advocating for. They may frame it as something else,
folks that are
but that's what they're advocating for. Yeah, and this is very much in line with banning books at schools, don't say gay, don't talk about race. So if that is not an ideology that you support or find yourself aligned with, you should not be supporting this verdict.
Correct. And I want to make sure that's clear. And that's kind of where I wanted to go, is that, Jack Kowalski, for all of his character, I don't see him as being I'm going to go and be a martyr, or I'm going to go have this mission and get parents' rights everywhere. No, he was 100%. I got to say, was contacted by the law firms or whatever who was associated with these groups, especially in that part of Florida, that are very focused on these things. I wanted to, that's why I wanted to make it clear to the audience listening is that these are the same folks that are advocating for the banning books. Don't
Yeah.
say gay, ban drag shows and all of
Right.
these other things, but like the really extreme aspects of that.
Yeah, the very, very far right fringe. And I think, with Jack Kowalski, like, and again, it's all my opinion based on, what I know about him and sort of some of the depositions from like other, which I have a couple of updates coming on this
Mm.
case. And one of them involves the deposition from Beata's brother, Peter, who was very tragically the person who discovered her body and was at the house while that was happening. But as I've learned more about Jack Kowalski and sort of how early he started talking about this lawsuit, and he also has a history of another lawsuit against, they attempted to sue the school district when they revoked Maya's hospital homebound status. I don't think that went anywhere. He also has a previous lawsuit against his employer at the fire department in Chicago. So he's got a little bit of a whiff of professional plaintiff about him. And I don't think he is an ideologue. I agree with you that I don't think that he necessarily cares one way or the other about parents' rights legislation. Like, I don't think, he really necessarily has that ideology strongly, or I don't know where he stands on that. I assume he's pretty conservative.
He's a good goon for the people.
But no, I think he's an opportunist. I mean, I think
Absolutely.
he, and it's very funny to me thinking back on like my very first coverage of this, because I was sort of like trying to put together, because, the other question about Jack Kowalski is like, what did he know and when did he know it, as far as like how culpable should he be for the abuse that was happening, because he was taking her to a lot of appointments. We know from talking to Dr. Sally Smith and Mike Weber, Detective Mike, who's a friend of the show and frequent contributor, he came on to talk about the film. And then we went through kind of some of the police records together. And I was kind of like, well, why would Jack go along with it? And he was like, well, they're suing the hospital for $220 million. So like money might be a factor, Andrea. Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah. It's like,
always.
Yeah, it's like, what's the question here? Like he stands to become one of the richest men in Florida over this case. Right. And like, I would like to live in a world where people don't drag their traumatized children through a 6-year-long lawsuit for money, but like, we don't live in that world. And so like, I think that can't be discounted as a motivating factor. But I think Gregory Anderson, again, based on kind of some of the other cases that he's represented and some
which
of
have been what? I hadn't gotten a chance to.
The only other case that I could find that had anything to do really with medicine is that previous to this lawsuit was a case where he attempted to sue, and I can't remember the name of the hospital off the top of my head, but he tried to sue another Florida hospital on behalf of the family of a man who died from COVID at the hospital. They were trying to, it's a little bit complicated, but they were trying to this was during a period where the ivermectin, which is a deworming agent it's used on people as well as some. I described it as a horse dewormer, and some listeners got mad at me and rightly pointed out that it's also used on people, though. But it's an anti-parasitic drug, right? So like there was these couple of studies that got debunked, and this was a very big thing for a minute with COVID, that people were trying to take an ivermectin protocol. So basically, this hospital refused to implement an outside doctor's ivermectin protocol on someone who was on a respirator and had very severe COVID and ended up dying. And Gregory Anderson was involved in a lawsuit against that hospital, again, a sort of medical malpractice lawsuit, which they lost. He is now representing this other family, the Kushneers, which is another child abuse case, where they are trying to, wage a similar lawsuit against really kind of all the same people, Johns Hopkins, All Children's, et cetera. They've gotten media coverage from some of the same outlets. So he is now representing the Kushner family. So I think he may be making this a specialty, but it has not previously been. But I think with him, he was doing a lot of like pretty far right YouTube interviews and like that kind of thing. So just sort of seeing who he's aligned himself with, I think we can safely, opportunism is not counted out either, but I think he sort of shows some more signs of maybe being really like a sort of a more true believer in the parents' rights thing than Jack Kowalski,
which is why
I
wonder who's paying his bills. Like, it's always follow the money, right? And Kowalski is not paying this guy's bills.
Well, no, because I mean, and I think people don't understand that, like, sometimes like the check's not in the mail for this lawsuit. Like this is going to play out over years in court. So it's going to be a long time until Gregory Anderson's legal fees are paid plus.
Right. But he has to get paid to do the work. Like the work has to get done the way, that a lot of these lawsuits in this, I happen to know in the field of like reproductive access rights, like a lot of those lawsuits and the attorneys that handle them, they work for or are paid for by these interest groups, that are these pushing these don't say gay or whatever, they're all these conservative action groups and stuff that are paying for their services to do this on behalf of the Kowalskis or the whatever.
Yeah. I believe he did the case on contingency. That is what he has said. So I believe that's true. But I don't know in terms of I haven't sort of looked into that, or I haven't heard anything to that extent, but certainly ideologically, certainly he's getting a lot of support from those groups.
Yeah. Yeah. And for those who don't know, being paid on contingency means you get paid at the end. Like if you win, you get a portion of that. It's a percentage, usually like personal injury law is usually like 33%.
Yeah, and I believe it's in that realm. And so I think that was, one of the things that is an update on this case of sort of what's happened since. So the judge required them all to go to mediation, which to me was so strange because I was like, and I believe that's because he is worried about getting overturned on appeal, because as you mentioned, there are a lot of appellate possibilities here because of everything that was bananas about this case, and also the legal precedents it sets for both mandatory reporting and also for holding an entity responsible for someone's suicide is very dicey territory. So
correct,
a whole bunch of in that.
There's so many levels, and then
just up and down. It's like they're going to have trouble, I think, picking the strongest ones because they're going to have to.
Well, they'll eventually. What'll happen is he'll file his appeal that'll name all of these things, and they'll slowly sort of either get settled out or you know,
and then they'll kind of pick and choose. So it's going to be a drawn out process. But yeah, so I think the judge is concerned, rightly so, about being overturned in appeals, and so he required all the parties to go back to mediation. And the only thing I can tell you about that is that they did not come to any kind of settlement. So I think the judge was hoping that everyone would get in a room and somehow cooler heads would prevail. Why he thought that was going to happen after these people had been fighting it out for 6 years and there was suddenly $200+ million at the table. I don't think that was realistic, but nonetheless, that did not happen. So now this will move forward to appeals.
Good. I don't know how the court a system necessarily works at these levels, and the trial court, now it's going to go up to the appeals, different judges, but it's still conservative Florida, who knows what's going to happen, but all these different legal issues are going to be going up on appeal now, which is good. That's good that it's moving forward to that. There's a couple things that I want to go back to and touch on. One of them is the but she was evaluated, Beata was evaluated, didn't have Munchausen by proxy, therefore this isn't a thing and there's no medical child abuse. Now there's so many things wrong with all of that sentence. Let's go back to that and unpack that a little bit about what all of that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the most common misconceptions about Munchausen by proxy / medical child abuse. And I can tell you there's a lot of debate in the professional community about whether or not this should be considered a psychiatric diagnosis at all, because I think it sets up such a problematic thing in court where you have this paradigm of this person is sick, and you can say they either have this disorder or they don't. And if they don't have this disorder, then this action is not happening. And I think the easiest way to sort of give people a framework for this is the one that Mike Weber uses the most, which I like because I think it cuts through. Pedophilic disorder is also in the DSM. Child sex abuse is not determined by a psychological evaluator sitting down with a suspected perpetrator and saying, okay, let's test this man for pedophilic disorder. He
has a predilection towards children.
Right, because it's also people without pedophilic disorder also commit child sex abuse, right? So it's not it's not a one-to-one, and it doesn't matter, right? Like, we don't care about that. Doesn't, like, having pedophilic disorder or having factitious disorder imposed on another does not reduce someone's culpability for a crime. And what we need to focus on in child abuse cases is the harm being done to a child. So it's very important for people to understand that even if someone does fall under that umbrella of factitious disorder imposed on another, if they have that psychological makeup, they have that pattern of behavior, it's not treatable, really. I mean, there are some cases where Dr. Mary Sanders from Stanford has done some work on this. Another colleague of mine on the committee, Brenda Birch, has done some amazing research on this, but it's a very, 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 very small number of perpetrators that are ever going to be able to get any kind of treatment. Most are never accountable for their behavior. So even sort of looking at it as something where it's a disorder that could get treatment is not really the case. And
it doesn't matter if you're
it doesn't matter.
Child.
It doesn't matter, because the point is they're putting their child in harm's way. And I say the thing about treatment because I think people need to understand that what you see happen in some of these cases pretty frequently, actually, is that, and this happened actually in the first investigation against my sister, where the court essentially made a recommendation of like, okay, ma'am, like, you need to get some therapy. Like, that is not an adequate solution to
I mean, that's not untrue. She does
situation.
need therapy.
Yes, but also that's not going to solve the problem. And you need to look at the problem of, like, as Sally Smith put it in a really distinct, like, the determination that she is making when she does something like a medical record review, and when she does, the medical investigation of a case like this on the medical side, is this child safe in this home? Are these parents currently able to provide a safe home for this child? And if someone is medically abusing their child, then the answer is no.
Now,
and so
which
that
you would
is
think this is not a controversial premise, right? Like,
I wish that were true. Unfortunately, it's extremely controversial.
But it is, and that's something I want to get into next too, about why this particular form of child abuse is not seen as, it's like so singled out, and it's like people will buy every other kind of abuse that happens to children by parents, except for this one.
Or not, unfortunately. I mean, I think one of the things that this case, and sort of looking at this wider pushback from parents' rights group and the sort of people that are advocating against mandatory reporting and really looking to push back on this, is that it's not just medical child abuse. The medical child abuse cases are particularly complicated, and there's such a bad sort of level of public understanding that I think that those ones are especially susceptible to that kind of coverage. But you look at some of these other cases, like the Viviana Graham case, she was another person who was in Take Care of Maya, or the Jon Stewart case, where these are like abusive head trauma cases. And abusive head trauma is like something that is currently seeing a lot of pushback, and that is very settled by the medical science. That is an area where there is not controversy. It is 95% of doctors agree. And of course, that means there are 5% of doctors that you can haul up to the stand as a defense witness, who say that it doesn't exist, essentially. But that is something that you would think we were very agreed on. And you are seeing a lot of pushback on that right now. And this is this kind of thing where, unfortunately, like this is a far right piece of things. And it's very analogous in terms of a movement to the pushback on reproductive rights, where you see, I can't remember what the number is exactly, but it's some 77% or whatever of Americans support, some access to abortion. And yet you're seeing that smaller percentage have tremendous success in the courts and tremendous success, in the legislature. And that is the same thing that's happening right now with child abuse, is that you're seeing a very effective pushback from what is a minority belief about child abuse, which is basically that, like, it's okay, or it doesn't exist, or it's not happening. I don't think most people believe that, but that's how these stories are being presented, is that basically any parent who's accused of this is not actually guilty. Because if you can believe that the 4 stories, when you dig into them, the 4 other cases that are trotted out towards the end of Take Care of Maya, if you can look at those cases and think, oh yeah, this parent, nothing appears to have happened here, I don't know what to tell you. You don't believe child abuse exists.
If you just had the context of those cases and whatnot from this quote unquote documentary, and well, I can't call it that.
This film, we like to call it this film.
The film. Okay. This film is like, if that's all you get is this information, you're like, oh my God, Sally Smith, she's horrible, which she's not. Your interviews with her are amazing. That is an amazing get to have that kind of insight from somebody like that. Is amazing on this topic. Y'all, she has this amazing interview in the unabridged on your Patreon or Apple exclusive access. I'm totally pimping her out here because this stuff is really good.
Thank
From
you.
what I know, those of you guys who are interested in this topic, you're like me in that you're obsessively interested in this topic. So you want to consume all the content on it. So that's why I'm pointing you in that direction. If this topic doesn't interest you at all, like, and you're listening to this anyway, hi. But it does need attention. But okay, so wait, going back to people don't believe this exists, right? So people talk about, child abuse. Okay, if there's you always hear the stereotypical, oh, here's the evil uncle or stepfather or grandfather or whatever it is coming and beating a child, or mom's druggy boyfriend comes in, lives in the house, they have a bunch of drugs in and out of the house, beat the child dies. Oh my god, people are horrified, like, how could this guy be there? We need to do CPS, needed to do something, da 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 da. Well, and then in this case, they did something, and now everyone's all up in arms because something was done. And I want to carry that over to our Gypsy Rose discussion a little bit too, because
Mm.
that is a whole the cognitive dissonance on this topic
Yeah.
is
Whiplash.
insane.
Yeah.
But people don't believe medical child abuse is real. And this goes back into a little bit of the, well, is it infectious disorder imposed on another, or what? That doesn't matter necessarily, right? Like what we're looking at is there's a crime of hurting your child, right? It's
Mm.
called child abuse. That can come in many forms. You can be abused in many forms. One form is this medical child abuse, and it's characterized by either like neglect or something like this. Can you talk a little bit about some of those behaviors, about what makes medical child abuse a thing different from other forms of child abuse?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, for one thing, it is easier to wrap your head around these other forms of child abuse, right? Like I think, again, unless you are really in this very extreme position, I mean, we understand that child abuse, sexual abuse not only happens, but is relatively common. 1 in 4 is the statistic that you hear the most from sort of RAINN and outlets like that. And we've made tremendous progress as a society in recognizing that is a thing that happens, and it's a thing we need to be aware of, and sort of understanding that that's something that happens within communities. It's not a stranger danger type thing. It is going to be someone in the family, or it's going to be a coach, or it's going to be a priest, or it's going to be someone who's trusted by the community. And this is a really helpful analog for medical child abuse, because what I've come to believe about it, and you do see a very high percentage of female perpetrators, so 96%. And, I think partly it is the gender dynamics that makes it so hard to accept. I think we understand that like men, can be violent, and men can do heinous things. Like we've all had to wrap our heads around that. You would not be able to live as a woman in the world without accepting the danger that men present, right? Like we
Correct.
understand that from the time we're very young.
Our natural predator that we're attracted to. Who
Yeah,
knew
that's
we're attracted to our natural predator?
that's like, I mean, I keep seeing this thing, on TikTok where it's like, would you rather be alone in the forest with a man or a bear? And all women are like, a bear.
A bear.
Yeah. And so I think, this is like, and that's what hashtag not all men, whatever. But like,
But
that's sort of a
not on
different
this
conversation
podcast.
for another day.
I'm an angry feminist. No,
Yeah.
no.
Me too. Very angry feminist, especially like how are you not these days? But nonetheless, that's like another rabbit hole for another day. But like, we accept that it's real, right? We don't really question the existence of like violent men and men that will hurt children either by child sex abuse or with physical abuse. And the thing about female violence is that we don't recognize it in the same way. And it takes a different form. And what Dr. Mark Feldman always says about this abuse is this crime of opportunity. Mm-hmm. And, that is who is expected to take the kid to the doctor. That's who expected to care for children, period, in our society, still very much so seen as a female role. Even if both spouses are working, like there's a ton of data that, women are doing more of the childcare, more of the domestic labor. Hashtag not all husbands, not in my household. But
Whatever,
Mr.
blah,
Nobody
blah,
Should
blah,
Believe
blah,
Me is a, well, I always just want to plug out my husband as like, it's not, but anyway.
Oh,
yes.
I know, mine too.
I like love our husbands. Hooray for the good ones.
My husband, yes,
parade,
fantastic.
whatever. But yes, I mean, statistically that is still very, very much true. And so I think, abusers will abuse where they can. And that's where it's really analogous to like why abuse happens in families, why it happens in, sports teams, why it happens in churches, is because abusers are opportunistic, right? And they're going to take those opportunities where they can. And when mothers are abusive, this is where they have the opportunity, right? With their own children and within the medical system, because it's very much set up to be credulous of parents, and doctors are seeing a child for 15 minutes. They're mostly basing, especially with very young children, they're mostly basing it off of what a parent reports their symptoms to be. And who is that parent going to be? In most cases, that's going to be the mother. So it is an opportunistic crime of, it's an opportunistic form of child abuse. And so I think people need to like frame it that way, not like this is a crazy lady that's doing a crazy thing, because and crazy is an unhelpful word in general, but I think people need to really understand that this is very separate from there are parents that over medicalize their children because they are having a psychotic episode, because they are extremely anxious and suffering from like postpartum depression. I mean, those are all situations that happen. They are relatively easy to distinguish from Munchausen by proxy abuse, where the parent is doing it purposefully and they are lying and they know they're lying and they're fabricating symptoms. So with Munchausen by proxy abuse, it is either a parent is exaggerating existing symptoms. So again, that goes to like there can be an underlying problem and abuse can still be happening. They do not cancel each other out. That was another misinterpretation of this case.
Oh,
Like,
I have
she
CRPS,
really does have
therefore my
CRPS.
mother didn't make
Right.
me
Like
sick.
both
That's
things
not
could
the
be true.
thing.
I also don't believe that at this point that Maya does have CRPS because
Right.
but so it's either exaggerating existing symptoms, falsifying symptoms and tests, or creating, symptoms in their child by drugging their child, by smothering their child, et cetera. And so obviously the induction cases are the most serious, but they are all the most harmful. They are all harmful to a child. And the psychological abuse, which if we're going to talk about Gypsy Rose, the psychological abuse that accompanies this, the emotional abuse, the educational abuse, they're often pulling them out of school for long periods of time. Just the way it sort of takes over their entire identity of the perpetrator and of the victim, is very severe and it's very serious. And even for those kids that do survive, I mean, it has a high death rate. It's thought to be between like 6 and 9%. I know a lot of my colleagues feel like it's probably more around that 9 to 10% mark. And it's very possible that it's deadly. And even for those that it's not deadly, it can have extreme lifelong consequences, both physically and psychologically. So it is really serious. And I just think there's something I think that it really violates what people think of as a mom. And I think especially because they can frequently present as very loving mothers. Some of them are very good at masking. You see all different kinds of things. Some of them really are pretty obvious, like Brittany Phillips, who we covered in the second case. Like everyone thought something was wrong. It just no one could figure out how to do anything about it. Beata, I don't know. It's very strange because we didn't have, one of the things I think that benefited the plaintiff's side, honestly, from like the emotional story they were telling, is that Beata is not here to speak for herself. So they could make her into whatever they wanted her to be. And what they wanted to present her as was this protective, loving mom that would just go to the ends of the earth for her child. That is not what is reflected in like Beata's own writing on her blog. But when someone's not there to speak for themselves, it's always easier when you have, and we love it. I hate to say it like this, it sounds crass, but knowing from a true crime perspective and the way we sort of metabolize these stories, we love a dead lady, right? We love a dead white lady.
Oh my
we can make her
God.
into whatever we want her to be, right? We can make her into, whatever. We just, it's such a,
anybody watching this or looking at it or consuming this can be like, can see themselves in Beata in some regard.
And just project. You can just project.
Yes.
And I think you can, especially if you are a parent who has had, and I think that that's one of the things they really capitalized on, I think, is that, there are some underlying things that certainly complicate this abuse and the way that sort of all these systems are intertwined. And like, I don't know any women who haven't, I'm sure yourself included, who haven't had an experience where they felt like the doctor was being misogynist towards them. Like we've all, you're just laughing. It's like, duh, obviously, right? It's like every woman I know has had bad experiences with the doctor where they felt they were being dismissed, talked down to, infantilized, condescended to, all the way up to like not being believed about their symptoms.
We can't find the source of your pain, therefore you are not in pain.
You are a woman who, though you have been around since the dawn of time, you are still a medical mystery to us. It's terrible. It's a real problem.
It is.
That's not what was happening here.
No.
And also, like, parents of who've had children who are genuinely sick, right, have had bad experiences with the medical system, have had, doctors treat them like shit, or doctors not be able to diagnose what's wrong with their child. That's not what happened here. Like, that's not what the facts support. That is not what happened to Beata Kowalski. They were not offended by it. I mean, the narrative they tried to paint was, this mom came in, she was being pushy. They didn't like her. They were racist against, Polish people. I wish I was kidding about that, but that was an argument that was made. Oh, it was like her accent and they were put off. And now, again, is that a thing that really happens?
Sure.
For sure. Like, are some doctors xenophobic? And like, yeah, for sure. That's not what happened here. If they called in abuse reports and did shelter orders, like the court and the hospital, for every parent that acted like a crazy person when their child was in the ICU, they would be doing it all day long. Lots of parents act wild at the hospital. Lots of parents yell at doctors. Lots of parents get pushy and insistent about doctors. And doctors understand these are professionals that are dealing with this day in, day out in a pediatric ICU in like a large hospital. Do you really think that every time a parent is inappropriate or yells at them, they are like, well, we're going to show that parent a thing or two and call them in for abuse? Come on. It doesn't match up with reality.
It's not. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. The behavior that we're looking at, we have to look at what's happening to the child separate and apart from whatever mental state the mother
parents' mindset. Yeah, correct.
And I think that's one of the things that we were just talking about, right? Making sure that you separate those behaviors. And I wonder if there's a part of me that's always like, it always goes, people discuss this, it always goes down well, my child has real medical stuff and my doctors don't listen to me, as you were just saying, and they have this experience and they're sort of terrified that like they're going to be viewed as that. So I wonder if the idea that may happen to me too makes people not believe that it's a thing. Like, I can't believe that person would do that, because that could mean that if they thought they were doing it, then maybe they'll think I'm doing it, and that somehow that mindset.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things I think to tease apart there. Number one, I think for parents that have had an ill child, legitimately sick child, and gone through that experience, it is, as a parent, your worst case scenario, right? I mean, we're both parents. Like, there is like your child being sick, especially like, gravely ill or having a chronic disease or a deadly disease. I mean, that's like the worst thing you can possibly imagine. And so I think it's very hard for people to it is very counterintuitive to think, well, like, why would someone cause this? And I think that's where talking about the psychiatric piece of it, where it's like they're experiencing an emotional reward for it. They don't feel genuine empathy or attachment to their child. Like, you kind of have to unpack it, walk people through it a little bit, right? Of like the why. I think that is important.
They're getting some kind of need met by the attention they're getting, or by whatever. There's a variety of reasons why people do this, whether they're in postpartum psychosis, whether they're having this. There's
and honestly, the psychosis and delusion and anxiety element of it is much easier to combat. That means you need to get that parent some help. They need psychiatric care. They need to whatever. That's not abuse in the same way that this is abuse, because Munchausen by proxy perpetrators understand what they're doing, and they understand the difference between right and wrong. They know they are lying. They know they are exaggerating. They know when they are drugging their children. Like, they're not having delusions. There is a strange sort of, compartmentalization and justification that happens, but they understand what they're doing. They're like other abusers in that way. And so I think that's a really important distinction to understand. And then I worry very much about the fear that stories like this one create for parents that need to take their children. Parents with sick children, all of us as parents, right? At one point or another, we rely on the medical system and we rely on our ability to trust those doctors. And for that to be, and there are bad doctors out there. There are bad experiences. The American healthcare system is a mess. All those things are true. But, there are also many, 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 many good pediatric medical providers out there. It's like people need to take a step back and be like, who's getting into pediatric medicine? Like, are these like evil people that want to snatch babies? Like, come on, is that what you really think? This is not a highly paid. I mean, that's the other thing is like, this is not like, if you want to be a doctor and make a bunch of money, you do not go into pediatrics.
No.
This is not the money making piece of it. Go be a plastic surgeon, or
go
whatever.
Be a
else
plastic surgeon. Go be an anesthesiologist.
Go open a ketamine clinic, apparently, and charge $15,000. But yeah, I mean, this is not the way that people make the big bucks. But, I think that really worries me. And I've heard from a bunch of people who are either in the area where this case happened or even in the area where, there was really similar media coverage on a much, much smaller scale, but nonetheless, that was national coverage about my sister's case where they, again, very analogous. They blamed the doctor who reported. They really ruined her reputation over it. She experienced a lot of blowback. And I believe very strongly that doctor's intervention saved my niece's life. And I heard from a number of people after I aired that episode and said, oh my God, I have a child that has, some kind of chronic condition. And I became so scared to take her to that hospital because I thought this really happened. And I thought that this doctor snatched this kid away or and it's really that's a really, really bad effect because you can see where that would be really scary for parents. And what I want to say to parents of sick children is I cannot guarantee you that you're going to have a good experience with every doctor or that every doctor will do a perfect job of communicating with you or of figuring out what's wrong with your child. But doctors, and especially when you're getting into things like a medical child abuse investigation, especially if you are lucky enough to live somewhere where there is a child abuse pediatrician, there are only 250 some in the country, and it's becoming a very embattled profession. But if you are lucky enough to have someone with that level of expertise,
and no one's going to go into it now.
Yeah. Oh, I know. My God. But people don't realize that actually child abuse pediatricians have less frequent findings of abuse than people with less training because they have more knowledge. They have more deeper ability to say, oh, this injury or this situation, if it's a medical child abuse review, is or is not, right? It's you want someone that has all the knowledge. You don't want someone who's less knowledgeable and just going on vibes.
I want Sally Smith reviewing those records. You want Sally Smith.
I think that's the thing is people are well, these pediatricians are just trying to find abuse. No, they're not. They are highly, highly trained and they are going to be able to say they're less likely to go off a hunch or a bad vibe. They're less likely to be well, this family seems creepy. It's they are the least likely of all the providers to sort of make those value judgments or those gut calls because they have the most training. They dedicated the most time to it. So you are not going to get your child, medical kidnapping, which is the idea that you are going to bring a child into the hospital for care as a non-abusive parent and get your child snatched away. It is a conspiracy theory. It is not something you need to worry about. Do false accusations happen? Of course, this is the world. Everything that could possibly happen happens, but this is not a fear that you need to have. If you are not an abusive parent, you are not going to be have your child taken away for medical child abuse. Statistically, right? Has it ever happened? Of course. Has a false accusation of rape ever happened? Sure. Is Absolutely. That the problem? Yeah. No, it's the opposite problem, right? So I think parents need to understand that this is not something they need to fear. Medical kidnapping is a conspiracy theory. It's not happening. It's it's not happening in a coordinated way as it's being portrayed. These doctors from 3 different hospitals in the Maya Kowalski case did not collude with one another for absolutely no reason. There's no financial incentive for them to do this. It is exactly the opposite. It ends up costing them so much money, time, their reputations. They're putting so much on the line to protect these children. And it is just... there is no incentive for doctors to report abuse if they're not genuinely suspicious of it. This is not a thing that's happening.
Well, yeah. And when you get these people who are screaming on YouTube or on Instagram or on the end of this movie about, oh, I was falsely accused and I send her this Christmas card every year, all of that stuff. Poor Sally Smith and the threats and whatnot she gets. But you get these people, of course, people who are abusing their children are not going to be very happy when they're caught in it. Correct. It's just like if you were caught murdering somebody and you come on and say, I didn't kill that person. I didn't do it. I wasn't there. Those cops are out to get me. And well, yes, our cop system, there are issues with that. That's not what's happening here. The people you
Right.
get screaming on Instagram and making noises about I'm falsely accused or yelling outside the courthouse, like you were talking about. I think the one guy that, these
Jon Stewart.
people,
Yeah.
they're so angry about this stuff, being accused of being abusers because they are abusers. They're being caught at what they're doing. So of course they're going to put that out there because they're not going to be like, "Oh yeah, they caught me. Sorry." As you said,
Right.
this kind of person is not never accepts culpability for what they're doing. Rarely accepts
Right.
culpability.
Right. And I think, I mean, it's really important to me to say, and I'm going to have someone on the show in a few weeks here from an organization called Prevent Child Abuse America. It's a large organization, and they do a lot of prevention work, right? And there are a lot of there's a lot of peer reviewed research on things that can be done to prevent child abuse. And I don't know how much this is applicable to medical child abuse, but certainly with physical abuse, these cases, often are exacerbated by it's like some psychiatric issue in the parent, or some, the parent's depression or substance abuse, or like there's all these contributing things to child abuse that can be helped and can be prevented, right? And it's not my point is not to just say like, oh, every parent that does abuse their child, that does find themselves in that situation, is just a piece of shit and scum of the earth and like is irredeemable and whatever, right? Like I do believe that like there's nuance to these things, but the solution for that is not to say that it didn't happen, right? And like, sure enough, you scratch the surface of the majority of these cases that have been covered as false accusations in the media, and you read the police, and again, police reports aren't perfect, the police aren't perfect, none of these things are perfect. You read even the story of what the parents said happened, and you're like, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
Just intuitively, that doesn't make sense. I have a child this age. That doesn't make any sense. And you look
Right.
at like the evidence that you can find, and you're just like, this doesn't add up. And like the idea that like, what they're using a lot of times is like, well, this person eventually got their child back, or the charges were dropped, or their conviction was overturned, or whatever. Okay, Bill Cosby, he's out.
Yeah, he got let out of jail.
Believe that he's out because he didn't rape anyone? I mean, if you do believe that, I don't know what to tell you. But like, I mean, it's like we really need to put that in these like, and the police, like, again, like I'm pro Mike Weber. I'm not terribly pro cop. There are massive problems with the police for like that. That's like another issue for another day, but something important to mention in
go
terms
listen
of
to Jason Flom's wrongful conviction podcast.
Yeah,
if you
right. And like, I think
down
that is like, people are looking at these as like wrongful convictions, and they are not. Because if you also look at like, unfortunately, the police are bad in a general way on both of these elements, right? In that sometimes they have wrongful convictions, and then a lot of times, more often, they just don't clear the case at all, right? So like in Florida, in the area where this happened, the police have about a 50% clearance rate in terms of violent crimes. And so and of course, these fall under violent crimes. What that means is a clearance rate doesn't mean they solved the case and got a conviction. A clearance rate means that it came to some kind of a resolution in terms of an arrest. So that's like way less than half that are ending up like the right person went to jail and appropriately was like, held accountable for this crime.
Right.
So like our justice system is set up so that people are less likely to be wrongfully imprisoned, even though of course that happens, and it happens more to some groups of people than others. They're less likely to be wrongfully imprisoned than they are to get away with a crime, right? That's on purpose. There's a lot of arguments to be made for that, but we need to recognize that that's the system that we're in. Parents are more likely to get away with abuse than not. And like, if you don't believe me, you need to talk to some people in your life that who are child abuse survivors, and ask them if that person went to jail and was appropriately dealt with. Probably not. You need to ask some people who had abusive parents. How many times did CPS show up at your house? How many times were the police called? Did anything actually result from any of those things permanently? Most of the time, not. So we need to understand like the realities of child abuse, how frequently it's happening, how bad the system is at dealing with it. And, also we can recognize at the same time how flawed the system is in some other ways, right? 76% of child removals happen because of, issues related to poverty, not child abuse, right? So like, you don't have enough food in the house for your kids. You don't have enough, or even like medical neglect falls under that, right? Where you're talking about like, well, you didn't take your child to the doctor when they were really sick, or you haven't taken the doctor in this year, and you're like, you look at that situation and you're like, well, that parent like is
They're
on
working 3
Medicaid,
jobs.
right? They have no access to medical care. It's like
They
those
don't
are
have a
problems
car. They don't have a
that could be
license.
fixed, right? With like resources and support. And like, yeah, take those 76% of cases out of the system, we'd probably be a lot more effective at dealing with actual child abuse cases. But like the situation is not to say, oh, all these parents have been falsely accused when there is no evidence to support the idea that they were falsely accused.
Correct, and all the evidence, in fact, probably points the other way
Points
that
the other
shows that
direction.
there was
Yes.
actually
Points very strongly in the other direction.
very
Yes.
strong, what we would call prima facie case that there is something going on there. On that same that brings us to Gypsy Rose, and I want to talk about this a lot. A lot of this has been noise around the Gypsy Rose case because she was just released from prison, and I am one of the people who's fascinated with them. We've talked we talked before going on air about a little bit about the documentary "Mommy Dead and Dearest" on HBO, which is an Aaron Lee Carr joint. Is actually it was my gateway drug to Aaron Lee Carr documentaries. And it is really good, and it is an actual real documentary, right? Presents all the sides, and she did it with Gypsy. Well, Gypsy was at some point in her early incarceration, I think, or right around all of that time, because she had interviews with Gypsy in jail and whatnot. Um, Now, she just served a 10-year prison sentence, or 8 years.
She served 7 years of a 10-year prison
7
sentence.
of 10, right? She got her parole. She was released. So there's been a lot of talk about this, and of course, there was this Lifetime series following her as her release, and then her marriage to Ryan, with her now divorce from Ryan, which will be shown on later episodes. We're gonna get that's a whole thing. But the thing about the Gypsy Rose case, right? She murdered her mother who was doing this to her. And she was sentenced to 10 years because everyone was like, she needs to be punished. But at the same time, look what was done to her. It was horrific and all of this stuff. People, in myself included, were like, she's a victim. I can see why she killed her mom. I know people are hesitant to say mom deserved it, but there are people who will actually say the words that mom deserved it and it was probably okay. And if you're one of those people, that's fine too. All of that stuff, murder's wrong. Yeah. But is the world better off because Gypsy Rose's mother's not in there? Your mileage may vary. We're very much on her side. Everyone's team Gypsy, rah, rah, go queen, go queen, go. Get your life together. Look at you. She's supporting, she retweeted or whatnot, or Instagrammed or whatever, your Munchausen support website. She's obviously starting to look into some of this advocacy. She has since deleted her social media, which is good, I think, for her. Ryan's not. Ryan's still out there, but posting the dog. And meanwhile, Gypsy's like, peace out. But, good for her, making her own decisions, all of this stuff. We all have to make our mistakes with our relationships. Come on, right? So she's doing that. We love her. Society loves her. She's being revered practically.
Well,
for getting her life together. They believe that happened to her.
Mm-hmm.
But why is there such a cognitive dissonance between her case and everything else out there, like the Kowalskis? Oh, medical child abuse isn't real, but yay, Gypsy, for getting away from your mom.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gave me whiplash because, and I hope people will forgive that if this is in some ways a glib reference, but it did make me think of this where I was kind of like, that the movie and musical Chicago, where there's like, Velma, and then Velma gets like eclipsed by Roxy Hart, and I was like, wow, Gypsy really came in and like Roxy Harted this whole conversation when she got out of jail. And yeah, I mean, it's been so fascinating to watch people sort of react to these two things, because I do think, and I mean, I want to say like people are also extremely critical of Gypsy as they were. And I was very worried about sort of, oh yes, we're going to build her up and go, yes, queen, and then tear her down. And sure enough, that happened in pretty short order. And we got an unbelievable amount of hate mail at Munchausen support after she posted on our Instagram. And I was like, what is wrong with people? Like, they were like, we can't believe you. And I was like, wow.
You're supporting a murderer.
I mean, and I was like, and that wasn't, I mean, I haven't had any contact with her. I've had some like back channel where I sent kind of the family note, but we are not coordinating with her in any way. Like, I really wish her the best. A lot of people were like, are you going to interview her? And I was like, I think she needs to go do whatever she's going to do. And she's like got all kinds of opportunity to speak for herself. She does not, unlike most survivors, like need me. And
Right,
so,
to
and not
amplify
that
her
most
story.
survivors need me, but you know what I mean? I mean, it's like,
Right,
she
right.
doesn't
You
need my
amplify some of
show.
these stories and stuff, which
Yeah,
is
exactly. That
yeah.
like it aren't necessarily going to be heard anywhere else. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of differences. And I've thought about this at length. I mean, I think number one, there are so many parallels, right? You have the parent is dead. Neither of them were ever sort of, quote, diagnosed with Munchausen by proxy, which again, we've covered all the reasons that's problematic. Neither of
Mhm.
them were ever convicted of a crime, right? Like, I mean, Dee Dee Blanchard was not even investigated. And
Right.
so that is really interesting. And yet we sort of accept, for the most part, people accept that this was a Munchausen by proxy case and that this really happened. And, and that Gypsy was a victim of this abuse. Some people sort of question how much. I think that's kind of ghoulish. But there's not a lot of like disagreement, right, on the basic facts of the case. And
Right.
the basic facts, again, if you want, I think the Lifetime series, I mean, it retreaded a lot of the same stuff, but like Erin Lee Carr's documentary was excellent. It was good context. She interviewed Dr. Feldman, like good job with that
Mhm.
documentary. Erin Lee Carr, I'm a fan. But yeah, so I mean, I think like people don't really question it. I think you have very different situations. I think two of the biggest things that play into this. Number one, class.
Mm.
Dee Dee Blanchard and the Blanchards as a family, they're sort of a lower middle class. Dee Dee was on public assistance a lot. They had the Habitat for Humanity thing.
She had a history of arrests for check violations.
Yeah. So if there's some financial fraud stuff, which
checks.
again, actually extremely common in these cases to find some element of financial fraud going on. And just coded. I mean, sort of like just her, her appearance. She is she's a larger woman. She had the family has these very strong sort of Cajun sounding accents. There's just like a lot of like class markers that I think people are reacting to where they're like,
100%.
I mean, basically, unfortunately, where a lot of people metabolize that and look and be like, yeah, that looks like a child abuser to me. Whereas Beata Kowalski, this is an upper middle class family. They had a pool. Beata Kowalski was conventionally attractive and thin. So, I mean, you have like these very distinct things where like there's a lot of class coding to who we are willing to see as a criminal and who we are not so inclined to see as a criminal and who we are to see as especially like a child abuser, right? We have some strong class lens that we see this through, although we know from the data that is class agnostic. And so,
Oh,
but
fascinating.
nonetheless, especially with medical child abuse, but nonetheless, obviously, like probably not a newsflash to people there that like we see those two things differently. I think the other thing is the sort of outcry from the survivor, right? So in Maya Kowalski's case, she is obviously much younger than Gypsy. She is not to the point, and I don't know if she'll ever get there, but it will be interesting to see, I suppose. Is not to the point where she's had a revelation. And I don't know what she truly believes about whether or not she was victimized or not. But I really need people to understand in that case that, to my mind, I mean, Maya Kowalski turned 18 while all this was going on. I do not believe she has a meaningful choice about whether or not to go along with the story. Like the pressure that child is under to keep up the line that her father is putting forth, is so intense. That is her surviving parent. That is the story of the family. For her to like, it would be unusual for someone that has not had any space from their family. I mean, most of the survivors I've talked to have had the revelation that they were a victim of this abuse when they were in their 20s or 30s or beyond, once they got a little space. So like, it would be unusual even for her to have come to it. And her mom died when she was 10. And of course that impacts her. And then also she was given massive doses of ketamine for years on end. Like, who knows what that's done to
Starting
her memory.
from when she was little, who knows?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on that there could impact, what Maya Kowalski is saying. So I think that people need to just like understand that and not like, I have seen some people be like, well, she's lying on the stand. I'm like, that's not the right way to look at it. abuse victims collude with their parents all the time for like
Yes,
a very
absolutely.
complicated set of reasons, and that does not make them culpable. In Gypsy's case, obviously, she is saying I was victimized. She is saying this is a victim outcry, and again, they
Mhm.
usually do happen later, and she did. She was in her 20s by the time she came to that revelation, and co-conspired with her
Nicholas
ex-boyfriend,
go to John.
Nicholas Godejohn, to murder her mother. And so I think like there are these big differences. I think it feels safer for people to say like, oh, this was a Munchausen by proxy case. That's not like a risky position to take. Where I know, unfortunately, for a fact that the just sort of to frame the Beata Kowalski case as a Munchausen by proxy case is not the popular opinion at the moment. So it is very interesting. I don't think people are making the parallels, and I think that is like that's a very multi-layered story.
Is it partially you think because like the Gypsy case is like it's all over and done with and tied up in a bow and it's been
Yeah,
resolved. There's been
yeah,
resolution and she's moving on as an adult. So we can say, "Oh, look at that situation. Look at how that turned out." We can believe it because it's over and done with and we don't
yeah.
have
It's
to.
sort of there's a period at the end of the sentence, and you also have, I mean, Rod Blanchard, Gypsy's father, who, was very young when Gypsy was born. He was only 17 when Gypsy was born. He was cut out of her life by Dee Dee Blanchard. And I think that's something that he feels quite a lot of guilt about not intervening. But I think there's also, and like, I don't think that, you have to completely like just wipe the slate there. But I think, by all accounts, and I do know some people that have, interacted with that family, like I do think that he and his wife, Christy, who's Gypsy's stepmom, are
Mhm,
really good folks that have her best interest at heart. They have demonstrated that over a long period of time. They have not
mhm.
ever appeared to me opportunistic about this situation. I think they've participated in these projects because Gypsy wanted them to, and I think that they are a good, safe place for her. And I think, but Rod Blanchard also is very supportive of Gypsy's narrative that she was an abuse victim. He's
Mhm.
not saying, oh, no, Dee Dee didn't do this. Whereas you have Jack Kowalski, who is heavily, heavily, financially and whatever sort of emotionally and psychologically
Uh-huh.
invested in the story that Beata was not an abuser. This was not happening in his household. And so you also have like kind of the element of the dads. Yeah, it's like there just isn't disagreement really meaningfully about whether or not Gypsy was abused. Whereas with Maya, there is a lot of disagreement about whether or not she was abused.
It's still too like it fresh and in its happening.
Yeah,
It's
it's
like
still
currently.
happening. And I mean, I think this is a "you're wrong about" situation, to paraphrase that, which is one of my favorite podcasts. But I'm like, I really wonder, it's like, if in 10 years, especially if there's like massive, legislative changes because of this, if there's like, if this is the moment that mandatory reporting goes away, like, how are we going to look back on this case? And I'm like, you're wrong about it now, all of you too credulous media people that are reporting on this in a dishonest way. You're wrong about it now, and I don't think history is going to look kindly upon you. And
Right.
I don't know what like Caitlin Keating at all like believe in their soul, but I'm like, I don't know if you have any concept of what you've done, but like this is eventually going to wash out, right? Like, yeah, you know who else like didn't get convicted? OJ Simpson, who we were all just thinking about because he passed the other day. And it's like, do people look back on that? And at the time, of course, it was much more controversial than people remember. I think if you talk
Right.
to people who sort of were older and have done sort of interviews with the jurors, et cetera. But like, like this is not like this isn't going to hold up in history. Like if
Right.
you are pro this lawsuit standing and this verdict standing, you are on the wrong side of history. And like, I'm here to tell you that quite confidently.
And I 100% agree. I'm also, with some friends of mine, we founded the Sociopaths for Good, motorcycle club where we're, cats knitting and our mascot. But like, um, you know, there are some, and I say that because I'm one of those people that are like, Gypsy's mom is dead. We don't condone murder of people dying, but in the grand scheme of things,
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm
you
right there with
know,
you.
does that
I'm
make me a sociopath? Maybe,
no, I
but I'm
don't
for
think so.
good. So
I think that makes you a person with a sort of with a moral compass. I mean, listen, like I think it should never have gotten to the point where Gypsy Rose had to murder her mother to get out. And
yes.
people look at that situation, one of the sort of critiques, you see of her is, well, she was an adult. Like, she could have just left. No, she couldn't have.
No, she
Like,
tried.
this
And
is,
she got
she
caught
tried,
and beaten up
and
and chained
people
to a
don't
bed.
understand that, like, how deep and how, omnipresent the psychological abuse is, and that, like, yes, technically, could she have left? Technically, was she an adult? She had no schooling. She had no work history. She had no job skills. She had no money. Where was she going to go?
Right.
And like, her mother made her dependent on her in that way, and psychologically, emotionally, and financially, right? And these are the elements of this abuse that you see all the time. Like Gypsy Rose, I believe 100%. I think it's totally plausible that she felt like it was her or her mother. And so
100%.
but she should never have ended up in that situation. Like,
Right.
survivors should not be tasked with offing their abuser, and that's the only way out. And I think, unfortunately, this whole thing and the way that she was sort of like, given this sort of big star turn, and this is not in a negative way against her, just I think, and I'm very glad that she appears to be taking a step back from social media, et cetera. I think she should like live her life for a while. And but unfortunately, like, she got so much attention and sort of stepped out of prison into immediate social media fame. Unfortunately, the message, intentionally or not, that sends to survivors is, hey, you want to get out of this and also get famous?
Yeah.
Here's what you do, and I'm like, that is terrifying. And like, we shouldn't, like, I think you can be supportive of her, understand why she did it, and not maybe shed any extra tears over the death of Dee Dee Blanchard, and still not condone murder. Like,
Right.
do I think she should have gone to prison? Like, yeah, I don't really see how you get out of that. And like, people need to be accountable for their actions. She, and also, like, there's also sort of this other kid that got picked up in the middle of all this that, like, I feel for his family. He obviously, like, I think
would
there's
love
some
to
other
see
stuff going on around him that,
something
like,
about that side.
yeah,
You
I mean,
guys
that's a
mentioned it.
whole sort of confusing element
You
of the
and
case.
Secret
Yeah.
Dr. Bax mentioned the Nicholas Godejohn angle on one of your Gypsy Rose episodes on your Apple Plus subscription, whatever, Patreon, whichever platform you prefer. Like, I would love to see that arc. Like, I would love to see a deep dive on like everything that like made him who he was, of the person who ultimately ended up, where he was at. The last like thing we've seen from him is a little bit of like, oh, I still love her and I always will. And
Yeah. I mean,
followed by her going, no.
Yeah, he's a complicated character. And I think it's important to say, like, does Gypsy bear some responsibility for pulling him into the situation? Sure. Is she responsible for his actions? No. Like, I think there's, and it's complicated, but it's like, Gypsy Rose did her time. By all accounts, she said, I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things that she said in the Lifetime series was, the first day in prison was the best day of my life because I'd never felt so free. And I was like, if that doesn't kind of tell you everything you need to know.
Prison, like, 7 years in prison was probably the best thing for her.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it probably gave her some structure and some, the chance to have friendships, which she'd never had before. And I think, like, it's very unsurprising that she, was like then getting prison engaged and prison married and all that kind of thing. I'm glad that she's not staying with Ryan, just because the origins of that relationship, I just don't see how that could not be dubious. But yeah, I mean, to say, like, just with Gypsy, like, I definitely, I wish her all the best. I think, like, she has a supportive family. In terms of, like, I also just think, like, if she eventually wants to get into the advocacy piece of it, I think that's great if that's something that's going to be good for her. And I also think maybe the best thing for her would be to, like, be done with this part of her story and just put a cap on it and go do something completely different that just, like, explores a totally different part of who she is as a person. And, like, I think she really seems like a smart, endearing person. And I just hope she gets to live out her potential, whatever that is.
And she's an addict in recovery. She's one of my tribe, an addict in recovery. So
yeah. And, like, she doesn't owe anyone anything. Nope. Like, I think that's really important to, like, I don't think survivors of crime owe anybody anything. I think if what they want to do is just personally sort of privately solve their stuff, it's like, yeah, it's great if someone's up for being an advocate, but, like, that's not their job. And we shouldn't, like, have that expectation,
Hey, fraudcasters. Everyone knows that finding the perfect t shirt can be such a challenge. I know I've always had problems with it, whether it was the fit or the quality. Luckily, the perfect t shirt does exist, and you can find it at Skims, the maker of my perfect t shirt bra. Now I have the perfect t shirt to go with that bra. From either crop silhouettes to long sleeve layering tees, there's a style for everyone. My cotton jersey t-shirt is now a wardrobe staple for me. I reach for it almost every day, and the fit is so perfect because it snatches me right in at the waist. I've washed it a million times and it's held its shape really well. It fits like a dream. I absolutely love it. And honestly, you guys, I thought like, okay, this shirt is going to be too small for me and it's not going to fit right and all the bulges are going to show, but it doesn't at all. I put it on and it magically stretches to fit me perfectly and it holds all those bulges in. Every little but last bulge that I have is all held in and it looks fantastic. I absolutely love it and it is super super comfortable and it is one of my new favorite t-shirts. You can shop the Skims t-shirt collection at skims.com, now available in sizes extra, extra small up to 4X. And if you haven't yet, be sure to let them know that we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select our show in the drop down menu.
I want to talk a little bit about you, just a little bit. I touched briefly on some of your things at the beginning, but you were a novelist and now you're doing this. And well, you do both because I think you're still putting out books, although your next book is nonfiction. I'm going to let you share all that. And you mentioned a couple of times your sister's story. For those who are not president of the Andrea Dunlop fan club like I am, and you don't know that her sister, she has a personal connection to this topic, I will let you explain as little as much as you want to about that. But how you sort of went from how you this was a personal thing and now it is a person, and how you've taken this to this much larger stage.
Yeah. So for those who do not know, and if you want a primer, you can go to season 2, episode 7. That is where I discuss my sister's case at length. I did eventually decide to just say her full name and really everything that I knew about the second investigation into her for her younger daughter. My sister has been investigated twice that I know of for medical child abuse. The first instance happened 13 years ago, and that caused a massive rupture in my family. And the result of that was that my parents and I, and really everyone in my family, became estranged from my sister. So she has not been in my life for a long time. The reason being that I believed that abuse was happening in that case and wanted her at the time. My framework was not what it is now, but at the time I wanted her to get help and et cetera, et cetera. Come to believe that that's not really going to be possible in her case. Nonetheless, she was investigated a second time about 5 years ago, and there was a 2-year-long police investigation that was referred to the prosecuting attorney, and the prosecuting attorney declined to file charges. And again, for those that don't know, all the vagaries of the legal system, that can happen for all kinds of reasons,
Any kind of reason.
which we are often not privy to. And I did not get any satisfying answers in my numerous email exchanges with that office. Of course, we want the framework of innocent till proven guilty. That is one of the tent poles of our justice system, and it is, I think we all agree, a good one. But what that means is that often people who are guilty of crimes do not get held accountable for those crimes. And that's especially heartbreaking when that means that children are being returned to an unsafe situation, which is what I believe has happened in my sister's case. So I have a deep, deep personal stake in this. It was um, the experiences with my sister were, and I don't say this lightly, pretty traumatizing for me and for my parents, who I'm very close to my parents, a very good relationship with them. And it took a long time before I was ready to talk about any of it. And I think that's always, when people have a situation that happens in their life and want to sort of tell their story, either by writing a memoir, or doing a podcast, or whatever. I always just put that as a caveat that, like, nobody should look at where I am now and think that this is something that I was ready to do right away, because it took the better part of a decade for me to be ready to talk about it. And I think it's really important for people to give themselves that time, because you really have to be in a place where you have enough space from it, I think, where it won't be just like constantly triggering.
You had
So
time to process it and do go through therapy or whatever other kinds of
yeah.
things you needed to do to process this situation, including sort of a storyline weaved into one of your novels.
Yeah, and so I mean, for me, it was really like it was becoming a parent. That when I was writing my novel "We Came Here to Forget," which came out in 2019, which is the part of that story is very heavily based off my family's story. And I started writing that while I was pregnant with my daughter Fiona, my oldest, who is now 5.5.
Oh.
And that was really what brought all that up for me, and where I felt like I wanted to deal with it. And like most novelists, I think you end up dealing with whatever your personal shit is. It's going to make its way into your work eventually. And so I was like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing now. So I wrote that while I was heavily pregnant, which was quite a journey. And when that book came out, I decided that I sort of dipped my toe into talking about, like, I have a personal connection about it. And then, that just evolved from there. I met Mark Feldman. He became a very good friend and brought me into this committee. And I sort of just started thinking about, like, okay, like, how can I use what I have, which is not a bunch of professional degrees, and I'm not, a PhD psychiatrist type. I was like, oh my gosh, I've never sat in a room where like I was just like the least educated person until I was in this room, and everyone has like 8 million advanced degrees. But nonetheless, it's just me and Mike and our bachelor degrees on that, on that committee. But yeah, so it's, I really just sort of started thinking about, like, okay, well, like, how can I use my skills to really like raise awareness about this and help, sort of the committee, when the work that like amazing work that some of these academics have done on this, and some of these brave doctors have done, like, how can I help kind of translate this into something that is more in my sphere, where it's like sort of storytelling and for lack of a better word, like in the entertainment sphere, which sounds strange to call it that, but I think it is like, I'm very aware of like the fact that like you have to tell a story in an engaging way to get people to listen to it. And so
Mhm.
I think, and I just saw like, as soon as I started learning about these stories and sort of getting connected with some of these other cases, I just thought, like, these are really compelling human stories. And these are stories that need to be heard. Like, people need to understand that this abuse is real, that it's happening, that it's way more common than what we believed. And people need to hear from these academics who have so much knowledge on this. And this is really something that, I can be a part of helping get out in the world. So I started making the show as a passion project. And then, in our first year on air, it really took off. And that has been amazing. That's allowed me to keep the show independent, which is really important, because this
You
is
went
not easy.
through.
Yeah. I mean, and this,
You
I've
went
had
through some
legal
issues.
challenges from my sister. I've had all kinds of things happen. And this is not, this, and as I learned, especially in the Kowalski season, like, this is content that I think I'm just telling obviously my opinion is all over it as well. But like, I think of this as, okay, I'm digging into the facts and I'm telling you what the facts are. And I can't get away. I mean, people don't realize, like, I can't get away with not doing my homework, because someone will sue me. Like,
Yes.
I am necessarily
Correct.
covering stories where everyone who is alive is litigious. Like, so
That's why we're here.
yeah, like, I cannot do it. Like, I would be opening myself up to so much, like, the reason I so thoroughly like fact check and I run it through legal and everything else. And so, like, I think of it as like, I'm advocating for, like, this form of abuse exists. It shouldn't piss people off. It does. So here we are, and yeah, it's been a really interesting experience, and I've met incredible people, and I just feel very honored to be able to tell the stories, to help people tell their stories. And that is really, it's been an incredible experience, and I love podcasting. I still consider myself kind of a newbie, and I just really I think it's an amazing art form where you can do really brave things that you kind of can't do other places. I mean, it has no gatekeepers, and I think that's its that can also be its downfall.
With the microphone.
Any idiot or any genius, I guess, with a microphone can just get on and put it out there. And I think that's like, it is sort of very punk rock in that way, in a way that like book publishing is definitely not. And so I think like that is, to me, what is exciting about the medium.
I just think it's fantastic because this is such a I feel like it is such a niche small topic, but it is huge, and it's like pulling it out. I've talked to you about how I had my personal connection with back in the 90s 2000s days of message boards. There was somebody on a message board who had this, who had did stuff to herself and then had a kid and did this, and it was actually in Tarrant County, and it was probably, it's like
Yeah.
the whole all of the things, and we followed it. We helped get her to a cop, and like she got her kids taken away, and she's moved on, and she has now cut off her own ankle. Well, I mean, she had doctors cut off her foot, but
Oof.
part of her own whatever. Anyway, so it's something that it's like out there, but it's like getting that exposed, I think, is incredibly important, and especially with the Kowalski stuff. And that's why I was so anxious to have you on, is because I want that narrative out there. I want to help spread that narrative that isn't correct. And you started your podcast with okay, we're just going to do this one season, this one couple episodes, whatever. Now it's a regular podcast, and you're working on your 4th season. That's going to come out. Very excited about it. You also have a nonfiction book coming out. Do you have a release date on that? And can you tell us just a little bit?
We just got our on sale date,
Well,
so I think it's February 5th.
I won't ask you to reveal anything here that you're not going to do
No,
on your
that's okay.
own.
No, my publisher would be happy that I'm talking about it already. So yes, the title of it is going to be, and this is an exclusive to your podcast. The title is going to be called The Mother Next Door. So it is co-written by me and Detective Mike Weber, and it is a look at 3 Munchausen by proxy cases that Mike has worked on, which we've all talked about on the show at some length or other, and 3 Tarrant County cases, and then kind of with this larger framework of like this, trying to put this abuse in context, and we do talk about the sort of moment it's happening in, right, with the Gypsy Rose and Maya Kowalski of it all.
Right.
So I've been working on the book for several years. We sold that book before the podcast ever came out. So this has been a big project. It's my first nonfiction book. Nonfiction, it turns out, is a lot of work because you have to like get your facts straight, unlike my fiction where I just make things up. I do research for my fiction, but this was quite an undertaking. So, but I'm tremendously proud of the book. It's coming out next February. So February 2025. And I'm really excited to share that with readers, and you will certainly see a lot about that book from me. And so that's my next thing I have coming on in the book world.
Excellent. Well, I'm very excited for it. Also, we're going to link all this stuff in the show notes, but if you want to just give a shout out of where people can find you and find your podcast, and that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find my podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's called Nobody Should Believe Me. We are 3 seasons in. I have some new episodes coming out that are kind of an addendum to season 3. And then our season 4 will be launching on June 20th. So that is coming up. And then if you want to learn about my books, you can find me at AndreaDunlop.net. And I am also all over Instagram at Andrea Dunlop, and that should give you plenty to start with. I'm very findable.
Perfect.
And
perfect.
I should say, also Munchausensupport.com is the name of the nonprofit. We have lots of resources there. If you have been listening to this and you are realizing that this is a situation that somehow touches your life, or if you are a professional that deals with children, very good resources there. And we also have peer support groups for survivors and families, and you can find access to all of that there.
Great. And I'm sorry, did you give me a release date on The Mother Next Door?
Yes, February 2025.
Okay.
I should know which date, but I think it's February 5th, but I don't know. Also,
2/25/25.
Definitely coming.
Wait, 2/25/25. I like it.
2/5/25. It might be that. Yeah. So
yeah,
yes.
that would be February 25th, 2025. Anyway, I just cannot thank you enough. We could spend hours and hours talking, and there's so many other things that I cannot wait to pick your brain about another time, another topic.
I will for sure come back on. This was an absolute delight. So
excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you guys for listening.